health and don't want to seek treatment, right? Or they do recognize that they have something going on and they still don't want to seek treatment. So we'll be back here in 2 hours to talk about that. Last I checked, we had a couple spots. So we'll put the link to register for that into the chat for you now. So if you are not registered for our Double Feature Wednesday yet, please go ahead and do so now. We have questions about getting a recording of the webinar today, and that will be provided, and I'll give some more details about that in just a little bit. All right. Got UK here, Memphis, Sarasota, Missouri, Florida, New York City, California, Eugene, Oregon, UAE, North Dakota, Kentucky, Illinois, Seattle, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Halifax, Holland, Michigan. Got a couple Michigans. Felix, my hair looks different. Very possible. I have, sometimes it looks like a different color. I got it cut. So many things have happened to it. Then I tried a different hairstyle yesterday. Seemed a little wild. So lots of hair experimenting lately. Alberta is here. Pitt County, Saskatoon, Louisiana, Kingston, Jamaica, South Africa, New Brunswick, Arizona, Quebec, Oakland, California. It's hot there today. I am not feeling hot today. I have a blanket on me. Washington is here, England, Scotland, Nepal, Iowa, San Diego, New Jersey, Cairo, Michigan. Awesome. We got people that are already signed up for both webinars. Just a reminder, today is Wednesday. Wednesday's double feature day. We'll be back here in about 2 hours to talk about I don't need help. What if when someone does not want to seek help for their symptoms of mental illness? Vancouver is here, Trinidad, lots of UK, Portugal, Philippines, Nashville. How do you join the other webinar? Go up to the chat right now. And you can register. So someone's confused. Yes, on Wednesdays, we have 2 webinars. We're about to start this one right now. And then in 2 hours, another one will start. So you can register for that if you'd like. And the link for that is in the chat for you now. All right, let's get started because we've got lots to talk about today. So today we're going to be focusing on the connection between substance use disorders and mental illness. And this is brought to you by Mindspring Mental Health Alliance with a special thanks to Polk County, Iowa for partnering with us and sponsoring today's webinar. So everyone's mics are muted, your cameras are off, Q&A feature is on. So if you have questions, hop on into that Q&A, send them over to me, check questions as we go through each section. If you ask a question that I know I'll be able to answer through a future slide, I'm going to hold off until we get there. And then I'm going to save a little time at the end for questions and answers. We'll end in about 55 minutes. So I'll just keep answering questions as long as time allows. Now, we do have 800 people joining us right now, and usually over the next couple minutes, it'll be probably at least 100 or 2 more, which is awesome, but that may mean I'm not able to get to all of the questions. So please don't take it personally or be offended if I don't get to yours. We just simply ran out of time. We do have closed captioning available. You can go to the bottom of your screen and look for that CC button. Give it a click and that'll turn captions on. Click it again and it'll turn them off. And then for anyone that is new, my name is Jamie. I am a licensed master social worker. When I'm not here doing webinars with all of you, I'm a therapist. Prior to that, I worked in housing. I also worked heavily for many, many years in child welfare, working with kids and teens that had experienced some abuse or neglect, many of them being part of the foster care and adoption system. Now let's go over our frequently asked questions. This is being recorded, and everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording in it. Also in that email will be all of the resources we talked about today. No slides will be sent out. We do offer certificates of attendance, so everyone who registered for today's webinar and joined the live session will receive an email from certificates@mindspringhealth.org soon after the webinar ends. Complete the webinar follow-up survey that's linked in the email to receive your certificate. Certificates are not available for anyone who's only watching the recorded version of the webinar later on. And CEUs are not provided for community education webinars. All right, so what are you going to learn today? First, we're going to go over what substance use disorder is, and then the dual diagnosis of substance use disorder and another mental disorder. We'll talk statistics, we'll go over treatment, and then we'll end by talking about supporting a loved one. So, substance use disorder is a mental health disorder where a person has trouble controlling their use of drugs or alcohol, which causes problems in their life and makes them feel upset or affects how they live. Now, substances are drugs that have addiction potential, and they can be prescription, non-medical. They can include alcohol, caffeine, marijuana or cannabis, hallucinogens like PCP and LSD, hypnotics, sedatives, anti-anxiety medications, sleeping pills, inhalants like paint thinners, aerosol sprays, prescription and non-prescription opioids like codeine, oxycodone, and heroin, prescription and non-prescription stimulants like Adderall, cocaine, and methamphetamine, tobacco, nicotine, such as smoking cigarettes or even vaping or the electronic cigarettes. And so while these substances are very different from each other, they all strongly activate the reward center of our brain and produce feelings of pleasure. And these substances vary in how likely they are to lead to a substance use disorder. And so the likelihood is called addiction liability. And it depends on multiple factors, including things like how you take the substance. Is it orally? Is it injected? Is it inhaled? The rate at which the substance crosses the blood-brain barrier and triggers the reward pathway in your brain. The time it takes to feel the effect of the substance. And the substance's ability to induce tolerance and or a withdrawal symptom. And so here are some results from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration from 2022, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So we see 4.87 million, and so that's among people aged 12 and older that have had a substance use disorder in the last year. About 1 in 10 people have a drug use disorder in the past year. And then among 12 and older that have the drug use disorder, 1 in 5 had an opioid disorder. With alcohol, we see about 1 in 10 people in the past year. So there's main characteristics of a substance use disorder. It involves cognitive, behavioral, and physical symptoms, where a person keeps using a substance despite facing serious problems. And these disorders are linked to changes in the brain that can last even after detoxification, especially in people with severe cases. And these brain changes can lead to repeated relapses and strong cravings for drugs when the person's encounters trigger the related drug use. So substance use disorder is an identified mental disorder. It's listed in the DSM-5-TR. DSM is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. It's currently in its 5th edition, the text revision, which came out early in 2022, and it's created by the American Psychiatric Association. And so in this manual, you'll find all of the identified mental disorders, information and statistics on them, as well as the diagnostic criteria. And so the diagnostic criteria is a criteria that someone has to meet to receive the diagnosis. And this way, professionals are able to use the exact same information to make diagnoses so there isn't any kind of confusion. So when we talk about substance use disorder, this is going to be kind of a basic overview of what the diagnostic criteria is. You will find in this edition of the DSM specific criteria based on the drug that is being used. So we see a problematic pattern of use leading to clinically significant impairment or stress. So what that means is we're seeing how this is distressing us often or impairing our ability to function. Doesn't have to be every day, but it is noticeable. It's getting in the way of us being able to function, whether it's in one or multiple areas of life. And so again, a problematic pattern of use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least two of the following occurring within a 12-month period. So we need to see that maybe the individual may take the substance in larger amounts or over a longer period than originally intended. They may express a persistent desire to cut down or regulate substance use and may report multiple unsuccessful efforts to decrease or discontinue use. They may spend a great deal of time obtaining the substance, using the substance, or recovering from its effects. In some instances of more severe substance use disorders, virtually all of the individual's daily activities revolve around the substance. Craving is manifested by an intense desire or urge for the drug that may occur at any time, but is more likely when an environment where the drug previously was obtained or used. Recurrent substance use may result in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. The person may continue substance use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused by or made worse by the effects of the substance. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities may have been given up or reduced because of the substance use. The person may withdraw from family activities and hobbies in order to use the substance. And so this may take the form of recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous, or the person may continue substance use despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that's likely to have been caused or made worse by the substance. And so when we're talking about number 9 here in evaluating this, it's not the existence of the problem with the substance use, but it's rather the person's failure to abstain from using the substance despite the difficulty it is causing in their life. Tolerance is signaled by requiring a markedly increased dose of the substance to achieve the desired effect, or a markedly reduced effect when the usual dose is consumed. So either we need to be doing more, or when we do less, it's not impacting us. Withdrawal is a syndrome that occurs when blood or tissue concentrations of the substance decline in an individual who had maintained prolonged heavy use of the substance. So oftentimes people will ask, what's the difference between substance use and substance abuse? And so substance use means using any kind of legal or illegal drugs. And when we're saying drugs, this includes alcohol too. A person can use legal or illegal drugs and not be addicted or have a substance use disorder. Substance abuse refers to addiction or unsafe drug use. Now, however, in the DSM-5 TR, which we just talked about, they've stopped using substance abuse that wording, because it can carry some negative stigma. So instead, we're using substance use disorder in place of it. And so substance use disorder can be mild, moderate, or severe. Now, addiction is the most serious form of substance use disorder. It means continuing to use a substance even when it causes harm. Addiction happens when the brain's reward system becomes overactive, leading to a strong need to keep using the substance. Both addiction and substance use disorder have two kinds of dependence, and that can be physical and it can be psychological. Now, psychological dependence is when a person's thoughts, feelings, and activities are focused on the substance, creating a strong urge to keep using it, even when it causes harm. Physical dependence happens when the body gets used to having the substance. If the person stops or reduces use, they experience those withdrawal-like symptoms. So in the past, the words addiction and addict and abuse and abuser and dependence were commonly used to talk about substance use. But especially in the DSM and within mental health systems, we're trying really hard to use substance use disorder. One, it provides a clearer diagnosis. It recognizes that substance use can range from mild to severe. It's not just physical addiction. And so terms like addiction and addict do hold a lot of stigma. People also often use these words casually, which makes real addiction or substance use disorder seem just less serious. So again, these are results from that Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration 2022 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So here we see 48.7 million people in 2022 had a substance use disorder. And so it's considered mild when there's only 2 or 3 criteria for that substance. And so we had just talked about that DSM. We listed 9 different criteria, and for a substance use disorder, there had to be at least 2. So for 2 or 3, it is mild. And more than half of that 48.7 million, it was mild. Then we have moderate. So 4 to 5 criteria are met. About 1 in 5 people meet that. And then for severe, it's 6 or more of the criteria. Also, 1 in 5 had a severe disorder. So next we're going to talk about dual diagnosis. Before we do that, I'm just going to check and see if we have any questions from this last section. So can someone have both physical and psychological dependency? And absolutely they can. And oftentimes that's what makes it so difficult to stop. Might be addicted to it psychologically, but we're going through treatment. But the physical pain of withdrawing from this substance oftentimes can be what brings people back to it because they can't get through all of the pain of the physical withdrawal. Or there's people that don't feel much of a physical withdrawal, but psychologically they have a really hard time stopping. Now, what if you have a client that calls themselves an addict? And people are allowed to refer themselves any way they'd like, but you may want to give them more information on it, right? So addiction is the most severe form of the substance use disorder. And so we're seeing multiple symptoms. But we don't need, if that's how someone wants to describe them and they're not doing it in a really disparaging way, or it's not impacting them negatively, then we can allow them to use the language they want. But if it seems to be hurting them, that they're speaking about themselves that way, then we can give them other options. All right, so let's talk about the dual diagnosis. Having both a mental health disorder and a substance use disorder, and again, a substance use disorder is a mental health disorder. So it's having both is referred to as a dual diagnosis. It also can be called co-occurring disorders or comorbidity. And so when these conditions happen together, they can make each other worse. Mental health problems aren't treated, substance use can get worse. And as substance use increases, our mental health issues may become more severe. And so this creates a harmful cycle that becomes really hard to break. So, which comes first, right? I just told you about a cycle, about how they impact each other. And so it can be really hard to tell which came first, right? Chicken or egg. Even though mental health and substance use disorders often happen together, it doesn't mean one caused the other. Substance use doesn't always directly cause a mental health issue and vice versa, but they are clearly linked. Now, alcohol and drugs can make mental health symptoms worse, and using them over time can raise your chances of developing a mental health disorder. Now, scientists have a few theories about why substance use and other mental health disorders occur together. And so there's three main pathways that researchers believe can contribute to the comorbidity, that dual diagnosis, between substance use disorders and other mental disorders. So common risk factors can contribute to both the mental illness and the substance use. Mental illness may contribute to substance use, and substance use can contribute to the development of mental illness. Let's talk about that. Now, both substance use disorders and then other mental illnesses or mental disorders are caused by a mix of factors like genetics, how our genes are influenced by our environment, which is called epigenetics, problems in different parts of our brain, and things in our surrounding, like experiencing stress or trauma at a young age. Now, about 40 to 60% of a person's risk of developing a substance use disorder is linked to their genetics. And so research shows that certain factors can make a person more likely to develop both a substance use disorder and another mental disorder, or have a higher chance of getting a second disorder after the first one appears. And so this increased risk is mostly due to some really complex interactions between multiple genes and how these genes interact with our environment. For instance, using marijuana frequently during adolescence has been linked to a higher risk of developing psychosis in adulthood, especially for people with a certain gene variant. In some cases, a gene might directly affect how a person responds to a drug, like whether the drug feels good or how long it stays in their body. And researchers have found specific genetic factors that make someone more likely to become dependent on alcohol or cigarettes. They are also discovering links between certain genetic sequences and a higher risk of dependence on cocaine, heavy opioid use, and cravings and withdrawals from cannabis. And genes can also indirectly influence behavior by affecting how a person responds to stress or increasing the likelihood of taking risks and seeking out new experiences, which can lead to substance use and the development of both substance use disorders and mental illnesses. Studies suggest that many genes may increase the risk of both mental health issues and addiction, particularly those that affect neurotransmitters, which are those feel-good chemicals in our brain, the dopamine, the serotonin. These chemicals help neurons communicate and are often affected by drugs and mental illness. And then scientists are starting to understand how genetic and environmental factors work together on a really molecular level. So epigenetics is the study of genes and how they are expressed without changing the actual DNA. And this can happen because of things in our environment like stress, trauma, and drug use. And these changes can affect how our cells read and respond to genetic information, which can change the way our brains work and the things we do. Epigenetics can cause long-term changes in which our genes are actively or inactively taking place without changing the DNA itself, right? So these changes can activate the gene or inactivate it. And sometimes these changes can even be passed down to our kids or even our grandkids, right? It can be passed generationally. But they also can be reversed through things like interventions and changes in the environment. So the effects of the epigenetics depend a lot on when these changes happen. Research shows that environmental factors and genetic vulnerability interact at certain stages of development, which can increase the risk for mental illnesses and addiction. For example, studies on animals have shown that what the mother eats during pregnancy can affect how her baby's brain works. Other animal research found that not getting good care from the mom can change how the baby and throughout life handles stress. So substance use disorders and then other mental disorders affect many parts of the brain. Drugs can mess up important brain circuits that control things like feeling good, making decisions, controlling impulses, and dealing with emotions. And these brain circuits can be affected in substance use disorders, depression, schizophrenia, and other mental health issues. Different brain chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, GABA, and norepinephrine are all involved in both substance use disorders and other mental health problems. And then we need to consider the environmental factors. There are several environmental factors like chronic stress, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs. So our ACEs are things that have happened to us in our childhood that increase our risk of various things, physical health problems as well as mental health problems, including substance use disorder. So again, there's several factors: chronic stress, trauma, and adverse childhood experiences that are connected to a higher risk of developing both substance use disorders and other mental disorders. Many of these factors can be changed, so prevention efforts often lead to a decrease in both substance use disorders and other mental disorders. And stress, of course, is a known risk factor. Stress is a big factor in causing many mental disorders and is a common link between substance use disorders and other mental disorders. When a person's stressed, it can make them more likely to go back to using drugs, even after they've stopped. The body's response to stress is controlled by something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, so the HPA. And what this means is it can affect the parts of the brain that are controlling motivation. So high stress levels can make the part of our brain that helps with controlling behavior and impulsivity just work less well. Stress in early life and ongoing stress can cause lasting changes in that HPA axis, which affects our ability to kind of control our motivation, learning, adjustment, all areas that are often not working well in people with substance use disorders and other mental illnesses. Dopamine pathways play a role in how stress makes it more likely for someone to develop substance use disorders. When that HPA axis is too active, it can change how dopamine works, which could make drugs seem more enticing. On the other hand, using drugs can also change how different brain chemicals respond to stress. These changes in the body help explain why stress can lead to more drug use and a higher chance of going back to using drugs. Treatments that focus on managing stress, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, have been shown to lower depression, anxiety, and drug use. And then people who have experienced physical or emotional trauma are at higher risk of drug use and substance use disorders. And when people have both a substance use disorder and another mental health issue, it can make treatment harder. For example, someone with PTSD, they might use drugs or alcohol to cope with their anxiety instead of facing their trauma. This connection between substance use disorders and PTSD is a big concern for military members coming back from war zones. Studies show that a significant number of veterans have untreated substance use disorders and experience serious psychological distress. Many veterans also have PTSD, and a good number of them struggle with both PTSD and substance use disorders at the same time. And some mental health disorders are known to increase the risk of developing a substance use disorder. It's often believed that people with severe, moderate, or even mild mental disorders may turn to drugs as a way to self-medicate. And while some drugs might temporarily ease symptoms of a mental illness, they can also make those symptoms worse, both in short term and over time. For instance, researchers show that using cocaine can worsen the symptoms of bipolar disorder and contribute to the progression of the condition. And when someone develops a mental illness, changes in the brain activity may make them more vulnerable to problematic substance use increasing because the drug's rewarding effects, and it's decreasing the awareness of the negative impacts or relieving unpleasant symptoms of the mental illness or side effects of their medication. For example, brain scans indicate that ADHD is linked to changes in brain circuits related to drug cravings, which may help explain why people with substance use disorders report stronger cravings when they also have ADHD. And substance use can cause changes in some of the areas, in the same areas of our brain that are affected by other mental disorders. So using drugs before the first signs of a mental illness may create changes in brain structure and function that trigger, not cause, but trigger a person's existing predisposition to develop the mental illness. So 50% of people with schizophrenia have a co-occurring substance use disorder. 40 to 60% of people with bipolar disorder also have a substance use disorder. 25% with major depression have a co-occurring substance use disorder. 60% of people with PTSD are also struggling with substance use problems. 20% of people with anxiety disorders have a co-occurring substance use disorder. 25% of people with ADHD have a substance use disorder, particularly alcohol. And 20% of people with OCD have a substance use disorder. All right, so next we're going to talk about some statistics. Let me just check a few questions. So somebody asked about medical marijuana, and it absolutely can be beneficial. And oftentimes, medical marijuana, because the two main components that we know about in marijuana, and there's tons, is that CBD and the THC. And the THC is what is kind of creating that high. And so sometimes the medical marijuana is very low in THC or has none, but has the CBD, and that has different properties. So it's not giving that high. It's just helping with oftentimes the physical symptoms of a medical disorder. But there are times where marijuana is prescribed or recommended medically for something like anxiety. There isn't a ton of research on this, though. And the research that does exist is evidence to both sides of how marijuana can be helpful and where it can be hurtful. Even in the same thing, right? There is research that says that marijuana is helpful for anxiety, and there's research that says it's hurtful. And this is because of the restrictions on the ability to study it, right? One, it's hard to study the brain in general, but there's restrictions on where marijuana can be studied, where the plant itself can come from, regulations from the government. And so, long story short, there just needs to be more research done on it. So substance use disorder is a mental health addiction. Why is it called co-occurring? Are they not one and the same? So it's just having two disorders at the same time. So if you were or someone was to have depression and anxiety, while both mental disorders, that would be co-occurring. So it's two mental disorders occurring at the same time. So could specific traumas like intergenerational trauma Yes, right? And epigenetics that we are talking about, the way that gene is expressed, oftentimes is impacted by that intergenerational trauma. That can be a big part of this. And so sometimes we can, it's easier to indicate that this is what's going on. Other times it's not, right? There are times, right, especially when we've gone through many generations, that we might not be identifying what the intergenerational trauma is. We may have been so many generations away that we don't even know what's been going on. And therapy definitely can help with kind of starting to figure that out. Great question. So let's talk statistics. So any mental illness among adults refers to the presence of mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. And we're talking about, this is the same study we've been talking about, or the same survey we've been talking about all hour. And so this is for the past year. It is put out last year for 2022. This year in 2024, we'll put out 2023. Okay, so 49.3 million had any mental illness in 2022. Now, serious mental illness among adults refers to the mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that substantially interferes with or limited one or more major life activities. And in that, we see 15.4 billion. And then when we're talking any mental illness, 1 in 12 adults had any mental illness as well as a substance use disorder. About 1 in 5 adolescents, 12 to 17, had a major depressive disorder in the past year. And then major depressive disorder along with substance use disorder is 1 in 5. 30.1 million adults reported they have ever had a substance use problem. 21.3 million adults reported they had a substance use problem and considered themselves in recovery or recovered. 62.3 million adults reported ever having a mental health issue, and 40.8 million adults reported that they were either in recovery or recovered. So next we'll talk treatment. Let me just check some questions because I know this has been lots of info. So someone asked, how does generations of smoking and using alcohol or having an alcohol use disorder affect present generations? And so there can be those changes in the epigenetics. There can be learned behaviors. There can be trauma, right? And so there's so many different aspects of why we do see substance use disorders run through families. And it's not just our genetics, and it's not just seeing it happening. It's not just trauma. Oftentimes it's a combination of everything that's going on within each generation. All right, so dual diagnosis treatment will include treatment for both the other mental health condition and then the substance use disorder at the same time. And so treating substance use disorder and other mental disorders together has been shown to be more effective than treating each condition separately. And so this is called integrated treatment. And in the past, they were treated separately. So an example of this would be a treatment center might help someone stop drinking. And once they have stopped the drinking while in the treatment center, then they might start to address PTSD symptoms afterwards, or maybe once they've left the treatment center. So we've basically taken their coping skill away, the drinking, and then put them out into the world to then address some of the symptoms of their mental disorder. And it just doesn't work. In a more integrated approach, co-occurring disorders, both of them are dealt with together right from the beginning or right after detox or stabilization. Specialists for substance use disorder are trained to handle mental health issues, and mental health professionals are trained to address the substance use. And so this involves different forms of behavioral treatment. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, can help learn better ways to cope and reduce harmful behaviors along with medication if needed. Treatment may also include help with housing, health, work-related issues. And in programs for co-occurring disorders, there's classes that can teach about symptoms and how mental disorders and substance use are connected. Education on preventing relapse helps people recognize triggers for substance use and learn healthier ways to respond. And even dual recovery groups, it could be at the treatment center, in the community, can provide a supportive environment to talk about mental health symptoms, medications, cravings for substances, and strategies for coping, all which can help in recovery. So these support groups can be very beneficial by giving the emotional and social support needed to maintain sobriety and prevent mental illness symptoms from returning. And the people in these groups have gone through similar experiences. They can share stories with each other, answer questions, offer advice on handling daily challenges. All right, so let's listen to a TED Talk. At the time of this recording, April Pooley was a PhD candidate at Michigan State University's Department of Neuroscience. She was researching PTSD when she fully recognized that she was experiencing symptoms of the disorder. She looked for a solution to her PTSD and her co-occurring substance use disorder symptoms in textbooks and in research. And one day she realized this wasn't where she was going to find her healing. This isn't where it was going to come from. So let's hear about that.
So I finally realized that my life is not a textbook, and recovery is not an experiment with a beginning and an end. And I acknowledged that I really had no idea what I was doing, that I finally began to find some relief. I started working with my therapist, doing breathing exercises, journaling exercises, letting myself scream at the top of my lungs. I did EMDR therapy, where I followed this little light back and forth while I thought about traumatic memories. All of these things I considered to be pseudoscience. But my nightmares and flashbacks actually started to go away. I began to startle less easily. But my real healing came when I started connecting with other people. There were so many people out there, so many women who, like me, had been raped or abused and had no idea that the reason they couldn't just get over it was because they were suffering from PTSD. I had to tell them. I thought I had this big secret that if all these traumatized people knew they had PTSD, they would be okay. But it wasn't sharing my scientific knowledge of PTSD that helped people. It was sharing my story, which is exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. I wanted to show people diagrams of the brain and bar graphs of stress hormones. This is your, oh no, I'm missing a slide. This is your brain on trauma. But as the people I was talking to started sharing their stories, I started sharing mine. Not my personal story, but not my science story, but my personal story of rape, of abuse, of addiction, all of the darkness within me of which I was so ashamed. But once it was out there with everybody else's darkness, it didn't really seem so dark after all. And that's when I started getting involved in all of these things like lobbying for women's health care policy. I shared my story at survivor gatherings and art shows. I started getting involved in helping victims of sexual assault on campus.
So this really just kind of backs up the point of support groups, as well as having a social support system. Going to therapy is very, very important, but avoiding isolating ourselves is going to be a big part of how we start to feel better. And now there are barriers to treating this dual diagnosis. Oftentimes, there are not enough healthcare providers who are trained to treat both substance use disorders and then other mental disorders. Policy issues like how healthcare organizations are set up, funding, rules, licensing, insurance, make it hard sometimes to integrate. And then also treatment programs often don't have clear ways to do things like guidelines, rewards for good work, checks to make sure things are being done well, and ways to measure success, which are really important for helping people with co-occurring disorders. And then again, there's still a lot of stigma around both substance use disorders and other mental disorders, and that makes things harder for people who are dealing with these struggles. All right, so last we're going to talk about supporting a loved one. Before we do that, let me just check questions from this last section. So if someone has another mental disorder, PTSD, bipolar disorder, depression, whatever, and they're being treated with maybe like an antidepressant medication, what is being done for the substance abuse or the substance use disorder? And so when both of them are being treated together, and we're recognizing that the depression and the substance use disorder are impacting each other, and what has contributed, like genetics, environmental factors, those kinds of things, the trauma, the stress, are impacting both. The treatment that we're doing is for both. So the therapy is for both. The medication can be helpful for both. So we're treating kind of underlying issues that are contributing to these disorders. Now, addition to the substance use disorder, or addition for the substance use disorder, may be having to detox from the substance. So someone asked, what if someone exhibits bipolar mania when drinking, but it's only then and happens infrequently after a stressful life event? So I don't know all of the details, but with any mental disorder, there is a diagnostic criteria that says that the symptom is not the cause, or is not caused by a substance. So if the only time someone's experiencing mania is while they're under the influence of a substance, then they would not meet that diagnostic criteria. Again, I don't know this person, so I can't say specifically, but we do see the diagnostic criteria for the majority of these mental disorders that it can't only be happening when under the influence. All right, so let's talk about how we can support a loved one. So helping someone with a co-occurring disorder can be very difficult. You know, your loved one might not admit that they have a problem and may not want help at first. Even when they do start treatment, getting better can take a long time. It's good to know what you control and what you can't. And you can't force your loved one to stay sober, to take their medication, to go to therapy. But you can make good choices for yourself and encourage them to get help and be there to support them no matter what. So our mental health and our substance use disorders are treatable. You know, recovery is possible. And many people do overcome these challenges. The support of family and friends is going to be pretty crucial in making a difference. So we want to talk with our loved one, you know, sharing our concerns and letting them know you're there to support them. Cultivate a loving, non-judgmental space to encourage open dialogue and understanding. And seek support. If you or your loved one need help, there's lots of options, including this national helpline, and it offers free and confidential information and treatment referrals, and you'll get this information in that email we send out tomorrow. And so here's some tips on starting the conversation, how you can help them, right? Choose the right time and place, private, quiet, minimal distractions. It could be home, taking a walk, sitting in the car. And express your concerns clearly. You know, be direct by asking how they're feeling and explaining why you're worried. Then we acknowledge their emotions and listen. Practice active, non-judgmental listening and validate their feelings. Offer support. Reassure them that mental health and substance use disorders are treatable, and help them find and access treatment options. And then be patient. Understand that recovery takes time, and keep offering to listen and assist as they navigate the process. And then, most importantly, don't forget to prioritize your own well-being. Being a caregiver can be incredibly stressful and emotionally exhausting, and seeking therapy can provide valuable support and guidance for you, helping you manage your emotions and care for your own well-being while supporting your loved one. And it's so important to remember, one, as a loved one, that you don't have to meet the diagnostic criteria of any disorder to seek out treatment, seek out therapy. But that's the same for having symptoms or struggling with substance use, but not meeting that criteria. There's, for everyone, a point where we're not meeting criteria, and then it gets worse and it changes, right? So every person that has been diagnosed at one point wasn't meeting the criteria. And so just because you read this and you don't see that you're meeting the criteria, but you feel like you're moving in that direction, you don't have to wait until you meet it to go and get help. Go right away. The sooner we get treatment, the easier things are. All right, let me just check a couple more questions. So how effective can medication for the other mental disorder, like an antidepressant or, those kinds of things, how effective can it be when someone is continuing to use substances? And that does impact it. One, many of those medications, people are encouraged to not even be using any alcohol when taking them, or very limited, and so that can be a danger. But also, continuing to use can impact the way that we are trying to go through treatment and recover. And so that's why this integrated approach is so important, and having the knowledge of how all of these things help and possibly negatively impact each other, and how to work through it. It is more difficult, but it is absolutely possible. So someone asked, what if their partner, or it really could be any loved one, will say that they have a problem and that they want to quit, but they're not really talking. They're not participating in treatment or getting help, and that can be hard, right? We can't control other people, and someone has to want to get better, and we can be there to be supportive. But it can be difficult, and sometimes it can be helpful to really focus on what their goals are for the future, and how they can get there. And that is something we talk a bit more about in our next webinar that we will be back here in about an hour, where we're kind of talking about, when someone doesn't feel like they need help, or they're not willing to accept it. So if you're using a substance and your healthcare providers are aware and do not have a problem with it, doesn't mean you don't have a disorder. Not necessarily. It really kind of depends on what information you're sharing. Now, if they pulled out the DSM-5-TR and read the diagnostic criteria and asked you all of those questions, and then made a determination that you didn't meet the diagnostic criteria, then that would mean that you had not met the criteria for a substance use disorder. But oftentimes they don't ask enough questions. You're there for something else, and that's what they focus on. And so talking with a mental health professional can be important in determining whether you have the disorder or not, or specifically seeing your medical care provider and saying, what, I'm not sure if I have a problem with this and I need your help. All right, so here are some additional resources. So if you want to learn more, need some extra support, some extra information, here you can find it. We'll make sure that all this information is in that email we send out tomorrow. We'll put also some links in the chat for you now. And then here are crisis resources. So if you or someone you know are in crisis, these are different numbers that you can contact to get that support. And this isn't just for substance use disorder. It could be for a variety of things. And it can be so helpful to reach out to someone that is knowledgeable, is ready to give support and provide options. And so all of this will be in that email we send out tomorrow, as well as in some links in the chat for you. And here are our upcoming webinars, including today's. So if you did not know or you forgot, today is Wednesday and Wednesday is double feature day. So we'll be back here in about an hour to talk about another topic. I don't need help supporting people who can't see their mental illness. And so if you haven't registered for that, there's still a little bit of time to do that. And I think we've got a couple more spots open. So hop into the chat and you can register for that now. And so for those of you here that are learning more about substance abuse and mental illness and have a loved one that either isn't recognizing that, that they need help or is unwilling, this could be a great one for you to learn more about kind of the thought process behind those things. So take a look at all of our webinars. While you do that, I'm going to answer, I think maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Which is better, the intrinsic or extrinsic motivation when we're trying to recover? And so intrinsic is our motivation coming from us, from inside, and then extrinsic, outside. And so inside could be you feel pride when you've made decisions, or extrinsic is someone else congratulating you, or being able to get a promotion, a raise, those kinds of things. And it's not that one or the other is better. Extrinsic is usually more motivating. We're usually more motivated by outside things. But we do want to have that intrinsic motivation that is there when the extrinsic isn't, right? Because there won't always be someone there to encourage you. There won't always be a reward for these changes in behaviors outside of us. And so we want to be able to motivate ourselves from within because of how it feels. Now, if you need more information, hop on over to our website, mindspringhealth.org. You can find us on social media, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at MindspringInfo, or on LinkedIn at Mindspring Mental Health Alliance. You can also send us an email at info@mindspringhealth.org. And then let's go over our frequently asked questions in case anyone missed it in the beginning. This has been recorded, and everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording in it, as well as all of the resources we talked about today. No slides will be sent out, and CEUs are not provided for community education webinars. But what we do provide are certificates of attendance once you've completed that post-webinar survey. Our goal is that everyone leaves here feeling like they learned something, and this survey lets me know if we reach that goal. The organizations that support our webinars want to know how their donations are used and what communities participate. The data is randomized and confidential, and no one's demographic information is shared. So everyone who registered for today's webinar and joined us during the live session will receive an email from certificates@mindspringhealth.org soon after the webinar ends. Complete the survey within 48 hours to receive your certificate. And even if you don't want a certificate of attendance, we'd love for you to still complete the survey. Your participation helps us to continue to offer these free webinars. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope to see you back in an hour. If not, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.